The day the judge read my aunt's will, the whole room laughed. Not quiet laughter. Not the polite kind people hide behind their hands when they know they shouldn't. This was the full, ugly sound, heads thrown back, shoulders shaking, one man near the stove slapping his thigh like he'd heard the best joke of his life. The clerk pressed his lips tight and failed to hold it in. The sheriff's deputy turned away, but I could see his shoulders moving. Even the shopkeeper who had only come to pick up papers stayed to watch, grinning at me like I was entertainment he hadn't expected. I stood in the corner of that dusty probate office in Broken Bow, Nebraska, and I watched 9 adults laugh at what a dead woman had left me. Mrs. Agatha Hargrove was there. She was the superintendent of the girls' dormitory in town, the woman who had overseen my placement since I was 14, and she had a steel gray bun wound so tight it looked painful, and a permanent expression of mild disgust. She was present because I was still legally under county oversight. Still, at 16, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be consulted. When the laughter finally died down, Mrs. Hargrove folded her hands, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Well, Mercer, I suppose your aunt has managed it. She's left you 160 acres of wind, a half-buried shack, and a joke people will still be telling by Christmas." I was 16 years old. I had $1.37. My mother had died of fever when I was 11, and my father had followed her 6 months later, walked out to the barn one January morning, and simply never came back in. They found him sitting against the wall with his eyes open, frozen solid, and the doctor said his heart had just stopped. After that, I was passed. 3 months with Uncle Vernon in Kearney, who drank his wages and didn't like the way I looked at him when he came home stumbling. 4 months with the Hendersons, who needed someone to watch their children but didn't need that someone asking questions or reading books. 2 months with a widow named Mrs. Cahill, who decided I was too strange for Christian company after she caught me writing measurements in a notebook I'd found in her trash. And then the dormitory, where Mrs. Hargrove made it clear that girls who read too much and talked too little were not the kind of girls anyone wanted to take in. I had nothing. I belonged nowhere. And now, according to the lawyer's letter, I had inherited a homestead claim 8 miles northeast of town, 160 acres of bare Custer County prairie, a small cabin built of cottonwood logs, and something the settlement had been laughing about for years. They called it Widow Bell's Wood Moat. Sometimes they called it Fort Mercer, which was funnier to them because there was nothing to defend and no one to defend it. My aunt, my father's aunt, a woman I had never met, had spent the last years of her life digging a trench, a continuous ditch, roughly 4 feet deep and 5 feet wide, cut in a complete ring around her cabin foundation. No one knew why. No one had asked. They just watched the old widow dig her moat in the Nebraska dirt, and they laughed, and they waited for her to die so they could fold her worthless claim into something useful. She had paid $11 for that land in 1863. 22 years later, it was worth less than what she'd paid. The cabin was falling apart, the trench was half collapsed, and now it belonged to me. The judge was still reading something about boundaries and survey markers and the condition of the property, but I had stopped listening. He said something about the trench going fully around the foundation right up to the sill line, and I felt the room go quiet in my head. A ring. A complete ring. Dug on purpose. Measured on purpose. Positioned on purpose. That wasn't madness. That was a design. Something sparked in my chest. Not hope. I knew better than to hope. Something hotter. Something that felt like the beginning of a question I didn't have words for yet. I looked up at Mrs. Hargrove, at her thin smile, at the laughter still echoing off the walls, and I decided I was going to find out what my aunt had been building. If you want to find out what I did with that mocked cabin on the Nebraska prairie, how a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a borrowed wagon and $1.37 turned a joke of a trench into the thing an entire settlement came begging for, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I found in that ditch, what I finished when everyone said it was madness, is a story that kept people alive when the worst came, and the worst always comes. I left Broken Bow 3 days later. Mrs. Hargrove did not try to stop me. I think she was relieved to have one less mouth counting against her ledger, one less problem sitting in her dormitory. I carried a borrowed trunk, 2 quilts worn thin at the binding, a cast iron skillet with a crack along the handle, and a county map that had been folded so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth at the corners. The road got worse by degrees. First proper ruts with wheel marks from other wagons, then a grass track where the ruts faded to guesses, then nothing but faint scars through buffalo grass and dry draws where someone had passed once, maybe twice, and the prairie had mostly forgotten them. I stopped hearing wagon noise from the settlement behind me. Then I stopped seeing fence lines. By the time the borrowed wagon crested the last low rise before my aunt's claim, the land looked less like Nebraska and more like an ocean that had forgotten how to move. The cabin sat in the middle of that stillness, like something the sea had left behind. It was 12 feet by 20 feet. Cottonwood logs gone gray as old bone, chinked with mud that had cracked and fallen out in patches. The stovepipe tilted west like it was trying to escape. The door hung slightly open, which meant animals had been in and out since the burial. But that was not what I noticed first. What I noticed first was the trench. It ran completely around the cabin foundation, a continuous ring roughly 4 feet deep and 5 feet wide, cut into the hard Nebraska earth like someone had tried to dig a moat and then forgotten to fill it with water. On the north side, one wall had caved in, leaving a raw brown scar of loose soil. Scrapboards lay in a heap near the doorway. Half-rotted posts marked the beginning of some kind of cover structure that had never been finished. I stood on the plank footbridge that crossed the trench to the cabin door and looked down into that ditch, and I thought, this is what they were laughing about. This is what Mrs. Hargrove called a joke. The wind made a low sound moving through the trench, like air passing over the mouth of a bottle. I had $1.37. I had no horse of my own, just the borrowed wagon that would need to go back in 3 days. I had no family, no training in farming or building, and no clear idea what I was supposed to do with 160 acres of grass, wind, and a hole in the ground. I was 16 years old. I picked up my trunk and carried it inside. The cabin interior was worse than the exterior had promised. Mouse droppings scattered across the floor like dark seeds. A flour sack in the corner had been chewed through so thoroughly that only the corners remained, stiff with old paste. One chair lay on its side with a rung snapped clean through. The bed frame stood against the far wall, but the rope webbing sagged nearly to the floor. Frost had already started silvering the corners where the chinking had failed, even though it was only October. But there was something else. Something I didn't notice until my second evening, after I'd swept the floor and stuffed rags into the worst gaps around the windows and eaten half of the hardtack I had brought from town. The cabin was clean in one specific way. Not surface clean, not swept and dusted clean. Clean the way a person's mind is clean when they have a system for everything. The hooks by the door were evenly spaced. The shelf above the stove had been measured and cut precisely. The single remaining chair was built with joints so tight you could not see where the wood met. My aunt had been orderly. Whatever madness the town assigned to her, it had not been the disorderly kind. I thought about that while I lay on the sagging bed that first night, listening to the wind move through the trench outside. My aunt had dug a ditch completely around her cabin. That was not a small piece of work. That was not something a person did on impulse. You don't dig 4 feet down into Nebraska hardpan because you had a strange Tuesday afternoon. The second evening, I was looking for rat nests. I lifted the loose board beneath the bed, expecting to find droppings and maybe a skeleton, and instead I found an oilcloth bundle. Inside the oilcloth were 9 narrow account books, 2 larger ledgers, a carpenter's rule with brass fittings, and a folded packet of paper. The packet was labeled in neat handwriting, for the girl, if she comes. I sat on the cabin floor with the lamp guttering low, and I read that line 4 times. For the girl, if she comes. Not for whoever inherits this land. Not for the county to dispose of. For the girl. She had imagined me. Or someone like me. I untied the packet with hands that shook, and I don't think it was from the cold. Inside the packet was a list, not a letter of comfort, not a farewell message explaining her life, or asking for forgiveness, or any of the things you might expect a dying woman to leave for a stranger. It was a work list. Trench pitch, 3 inches drop per running rod, southeast toward the draw. Cover spans, 4 feet between posts maximum, or the boards will bow under snow load. Hatch dimensions, 2 feet by 3 feet, hinged on the cabin side, positioned within arm's reach of the stove, and at the bottom in the same neat handwriting. If you are reading this, do the north side first. The north side is where winter enters angry. I sat there on the cold floor with that packet in my lap, and I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I had come all this way expecting nothing, prepared for a joke, ready to confirm what everyone in Broken Bow believed, that my aunt had been a madwoman who wasted her last years digging a useless ditch around a dying cabin. Instead, I had found instructions. I opened the first of the narrow account books. The handwriting was different here, quicker, more cramped, written in the margins of days rather than the measured strokes of final thoughts. The entries were dated. The first one began in 1863. 22 years of observations. 22 Nebraska winters recorded in a dead woman's hand. I read until the lamp ran dry. Isabel Bell Mercer had not been building a moat. She had been solving a problem that no one else had bothered to name. The earliest journals were mostly about the cold, where it came from, how it moved, when it arrived, and through which gaps it entered. She had measured floor temperatures in different parts of the cabin, marking which boards frosted first and which stayed warmer longest. She had noted wind direction and correlated it with overnight fuel consumption. She had counted the hours between stoking the fire and waking to ice in the water basin, and she had tracked those hours across years of winters until patterns emerged. Year 6. North wind under the floor robbed the stove faster than any broken window. I could seal every chink and still lose heat downward. The cold doesn't pour in, it steals from below. Year 11. Wood stacked against the north wall stays drier than wood left exposed, but only if the top is covered and the stack slopes away from the cabin. Snow finds every horizontal surface. Slant defeats it. Year 17. Tried banking earth against the foundation to cut the underfloor wind. Some improvement, but the cold air is heavy. It wants to sink. What if I gave it somewhere lower to go? That was the first sketch of the trench, a rough pencil drawing showing a continuous ring cut around the cabin foundation, with arrows indicating how the coldest, densest air would flow downward into the ditch, rather than pooling beneath the floor. Year 21. The ring is dug. The hatch is framed. I need one more good autumn to finish the cover and fill it properly with wood. The settlement thinks I've lost my mind. Let them. By January, they'll see. But she never got that autumn. The final entry was dated 3 weeks before I arrived. The handwriting had grown unsteady, the letters thinning like the woman who made them. Body failing, work unfinished. Perhaps someone will come who can finish it. Perhaps not. But I will leave what I know. What saves a house on the prairie is not always what you build above ground. Sometimes salvation is the ring you cut where the cold wants to run. I put down the journal and I sat very still on my aunt's floor in my aunt's cabin above my aunt's half-finished trench, and I cried. Not from grief for a woman I had never met. Not from sadness or self-pity or the weight of my own circumstances. I cried because I recognized her. I recognized the mind that measured and recorded and refused to accept that the cold was simply something to endure. I recognized the stubbornness that kept working even when everyone laughed. I recognized the loneliness of being the only person who saw a problem clearly while everyone around you saw madness. Someone like me had come before me, and she had left me a map. I found out later what people in Broken Bow had said about her. Jed Purcell, who ran the general store, had called her that ditch widow and told anyone who would listen that she was trying to outsmart winter with a shovel. Mrs. Hargrove had refused to discuss her at all, which I learned was how Mrs. Hargrove handled anything that embarrassed her sense of propriety. The land agent had reportedly tried twice to buy the claim cheap before she died, certain that it would revert to the county anyway, and hoping to fold it into a larger parcel near a proposed wagon route. None of them had read her journals. None of them had measured the floor temperatures or tracked the wind patterns, or watched where frost formed first on winter mornings. They had looked at an old woman digging a ditch, and they had seen exactly what they expected to see. Foolishness born of solitude, labor wasted by a mind that had broken down. But I had the notebooks now. I had the carpenter's rule. I had the measurements. I laid the rule across the sketch in Journal 17 and compared it to the trench outside my door. The dimensions matched. The angles matched. The placement of the posts matched, although half of them had rotted and would need replacing. My aunt had been right. The settlement had been wrong, and she had died 3 weeks before she could prove it. I said it aloud to the empty cabin, to the journals spread across the floor, to the woman who had written those careful observations decade after decade while her neighbors laughed. Then I'll finish it. The first week nearly killed me. I don't say that for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. I burned through more wood than I had calculated because the trench was unfinished and the underfloor wind cut through every gap in the chinking. I woke each morning to ice in the water basin and frost on the inside of the windows and a coldness in my bones that took until noon to shake. I misjudged the food situation badly and found myself down to half a sack of cornmeal by day 5, with no money to spare and the nearest neighbor miles away. My hands split at the knuckles from digging and hauling. The skin cracked open along the lines where the shovel handle pressed hardest, and at night I could feel my pulse beating in the raw places like small trapped hearts. The wind under the floorboards made a sound like running water, constant and cold, and I dreamed about drowning even though the nearest creek was half a mile off. By the end of the second week, I had lost weight I could not afford to lose. My dresses hung loose at the waist. My cheeks had gone hollow in a way that made me look older than 16 and younger at the same time, the kind of face you see on children who have learned too early what hunger means. An early November blow came through and caved in another section of the trench wall on the north side. I stood on the footbridge looking at the raw gash of collapsed earth, and I thought about Mrs. Hargrove's dormitory. I thought about warm meals I hadn't earned. I thought about the humiliation of going back and asking for a bed and hearing her say, with that particular twist of satisfaction in her voice, "Well, Mercer, I suppose even you have limits." I sat down on the footbridge with my feet hanging over the edge of the trench, and I watched the sky go dark, and I considered giving up. The cold was too much. The work was too much. The loneliness was a weight I had not expected, heavier than hunger, heavier than exhaustion. I had not spoken to another human being in 12 days. I had not heard my own name in longer. I could walk back to Broken Bow. It would take most of a day, but I could do it. I could let Mrs. Hargrove win. What stopped me was not courage. I want to be clear about that. It was not bravery or determination or any of the things people put in stories to make the hard parts sound noble. What stopped me was the packet. The one that said, for the girl, if she comes. I went back inside and I unfolded those instructions again, and I read the bottom line. Do the north side first. The north side is where winter enters angry. My aunt had written that for someone. She had written it believing that someone might come, someone like her, someone who would read the journals and understand the measurements and see the trench not as madness, but as engineering. She had believed I might exist, and she had given me the one piece of information I needed most. Where to start? I got up off the floor. I ate the last of my cornmeal. I sharpened the shovel on a stone I found near the creek bed, and the next morning, before dawn, I started digging. The north side is where winter enters angry. I believed her. The land provided barely enough to keep me alive while I worked. I found a rabbit warren half a mile southwest and snared one thin animal every 4 or 5 days. I discovered wild onions in the creek bed and pulled them until my fingers were stained yellow and my clothes smelled like the earth. I gathered dried buffalo chips for fuel when the wood ran short, which burned hot, but smelled like exactly what they were. I walked to the small cottonwood stand along the creek and dragged back deadfall branches, one at a time, because I had no horse and no cart. Each trip took 2 hours. Each branch was not quite enough and never quite dry. But I did not starve. And slowly, day by day, the trench began to take shape. I recut the collapsed north wall, angling my shovel to match the pitch my aunt had specified in the packet. 3 inches of drop per running rod, sloping southeast toward the low draw where water would naturally drain. I laid broken fieldstone in the wettest stretches where standing water might collect. I drove salvaged posts every 4 feet along the trench perimeter, setting them deep enough that a heavy snow load wouldn't shift them. I measured everything twice. I read the journals every night by firelight and compared my work to her sketches. I made mistakes. The first post line was crooked by 1.5 inches, and I had to pull them all up and reset them, but I corrected them before moving on. By the first week of December, I had the north and west walls stable and shored. The posts stood in clean rows. The trench bottom was pitched and drained. I hadn't filled it with wood yet. I hadn't built the cover. I hadn't tested anything. But the shape was right. I stood at the edge of that trench on a clear December morning, and I looked at what my hands had made, and I thought, maybe this will work. The first real test came by accident. I'd been stacking wood for 3 days, cottonwood and cedar, split with a borrowed axe and hauled from the creek in bundles I could carry. The work was brutal. My shoulders ached in ways I had not known shoulders could ache. My palms had blistered, then calloused, then blistered again over the calluses. I had filled the north side of the trench to sill height, maybe 22 running feet of stacked fuel, and laid scrap boards over the top to shed snow and rain. It was rough work, the kind of construction a real carpenter would have laughed at. But it was solid. Then, on the 4th morning, the first hard wind came. Not a blizzard. Not the kind of storm that kills cattle standing in their traces. Just a steady northwest blow, the kind Nebraska sends down from somewhere colder as a warning shot before January arrives. I woke to it before dawn. The cabin shook against its foundation. The wind sounded different than it had before, higher, more urgent, with a whistle in it like something trying to get in. I lay on the bed waiting for the cold to find me. I had been waking cold every morning since I arrived, feeling the frost creep through the floorboards despite the fire I had banked the night before. But that morning, something was different. I sat up. I put my feet on the floor. The boards were cool, but not ice cold. Not the knife-edge chill that had been waking me for weeks. I stood. I walked to the far corner of the cabin, the corner where the frost always gathered thickest, where the wind had been stealing heat from below since before I arrived. I knelt. I pressed my palm flat against the boards. Warm. Not hot, not summer warm, but warm enough that I could feel my own blood moving in my hand rather than the cold pressing it still. The filled trench was blocking the wind. I knelt there with my palm against the floor in the half-dark of an early winter morning, and I understood for the first time that my aunt had been right. The trench was not a moat. It was a wall built below ground, heavy with wood, blocking the channel where cold air wanted to run. What saves a house on the prairie is not always what you build above ground. I opened the rough hatch I had framed near the stove, 2 feet by 3 feet, just as the instructions specified, and I reached down into the trench and pulled up an armload of firewood. It was dry. Dry to the touch, dry to the smell. Dry in a way that firewood left exposed on the prairie almost never is in winter. The cover boards had shed the moisture. The drainage pitch had kept the trench from pooling. The wood itself had stayed above the raw soil on the crosspieces I had laid. I sat on the floor of my aunt's cabin with dry firewood in my arms and whined howling outside, and I laughed. Then I started crying. Then I laughed again because my aunt had been right, and I had finished what she started, and I was not going to freeze to death in this cabin on this prairie in this winter that everyone said would kill me. Nels Sorensen arrived the next afternoon. I did not know who he was at first. I heard wagon wheels on the hardpack and went to the door expecting trouble. The land agent, maybe, come to make his offer again now that my aunt was properly buried. Or one of Mrs. Hargrove's people sent to check whether the orphan had died yet and the county could reclaim the land. Instead, I saw an old man stepping down from a battered buckboard, moving carefully the way people move when their joints have started making predictions about weather. He was 72 years old, though I wouldn't learn that until later. He had shoulders that had once been broad and hands that had once been strong, and eyes that had not lost their sharpness despite the years. He walked to the edge of the trench and stood there looking at my work, at the posts, at the coverboards, at the careful line where the stacked wood met the cabin sill. I waited for him to laugh. Everyone in Broken Bow had laughed. He didn't laugh. He stamped his boots once against the frozen ground, lifted his face to the wind like he was reading something written in it, and said, "I told Belle Mercer folks were watching the snow. She was watching the wind." I did not know what to say. He looked at me for the first time. "You're the girl, then, the one she left it to." Ruth Mercer. Nels Sorensen. He nodded once, the way men do when names are exchanged and business can proceed. "I played checkers with your aunt on Sundays, helped her set this cabin on its sill years back. She talked about this." He gestured at the trench. "Talked about it for years, floor cold, wind running under, how everybody else was looking at the wrong problem. The town said she was crazy. The town says lots of things." Nels stepped onto the footbridge and tested the boards with his weight. "You finished the north side." "When?" "Last week, the post before that." "And it works?" I nodded. "The floor was warm this morning, first time since I got here." Nels Sorensen looked at the trench, and then at the cabin, and then at me. And for the first time since I had arrived at this place, someone looked at me like I was something other than a joke. "Your aunt was right," he said. "You're not digging a moat. You're teaching the wind where it cannot go." He stayed for 3 hours that first day. He walked the full perimeter of the trench, studying the walls, the drainage pitch, the post placement. He asked questions about the coverboards and the hatch dimensions and where I had learned to slope a drainage line. When I told him I had followed my aunt's instructions, he nodded as though that explained everything. He told me about Isabel, not the legend the town had made, the crazy widow digging useless ditches, but the woman he had actually known. She had been sharp, he said, observant in ways that made people uncomfortable. She had measured things nobody else bothered to measure and asked questions nobody else thought to ask. When she couldn't find the answers, she built experiments. The trench was just the largest of them. "She knew she was dying," Nels said. "She knew she wouldn't finish. That's why she wrote those notes. She wanted someone to come after her." "I almost didn't." "But you did." He looked at the trench, at the work still undone. "And now you'll finish. If you want help, I can come back. I'm no good for heavy digging anymore." He touched his left shoulder, which sat slightly lower than the right. "Wagon took this one years back, but I can teach you to frame. I can show you how to brace a structure against wind. Your aunt had the science. She didn't have the carpentry." "Why would you help me?" Nels was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The planes took my wife in the fever spring of 1876. They almost took me more times than I can count. But Belle Mercer saw something I didn't see for 40 years, that we were fighting the cold in all the wrong places." He turned toward his wagon. "Your aunt was right. I'd like to see someone prove it." He came back 3 days later with a brace and bit set and a load of salvaged lumber. And the real work began. What I had not understood yet was how little time we had. The trench was working, but only partially. I had filled the north and west sides roughly 22 feet each, but the south and east still gaped open, raw ditches that let the wind curl around and find its way beneath the floor from new angles. The improvement was real, but not complete. On bad nights, I could still feel cold air pooling under the cabin, slipping through the gaps in my defense. Nels helped where his body allowed. He couldn't dig, the shoulder, but he could measure and mark and teach me how to cut joints that would hold under snow load. He showed me how to brace a corner post so it wouldn't twist when the ground heaved in spring. He explained why my aunt had specified 4-foot spans for the coverboards rather than 6. Less beautiful, but less likely to collapse when ice accumulated. The work was brutal, and the clock was always running. Every morning I woke wondering whether this would be the day the real winter arrived, not the warning shots we had been getting, but the deep cold that could kill you between the cabin and the woodpile. By Christmas 1885, the south wall was covered and the hatch was properly framed. By New Year, the full ring held just over 3 cords of split wood stacked to sill height around the entire cabin perimeter. By mid-January, my hands no longer looked like a girl's hands. They were calloused across the palms, scarred at the knuckles, permanently creased with dirt that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. I had lost 15 pounds I didn't have to lose, but I had stopped losing weight. The rabbit snares and wild onions, an occasional charity from Nels, a sack of flour, a jar of preserves his daughter had canned, had stabilized me at a weight that felt like survival rather than starvation. And the cabin was warm, not comfortable, not luxurious, but warm in a way it had never been before. The stove drew better because the floor wasn't stealing heat downward. I used roughly a third less wood than I had been burning before the trench was filled, because the ring of fuel around the foundation acted as insulation against the wind that had been robbing me. I measured the floor temperature one morning the way my aunt had taught me in her journals, bare feet pressed flat against the boards, counting heartbeats until the cold became painful. I got to 60 before I gave up. The floor by the stove side was holding in the low 60s. The far corner, where frost had gathered every morning before, was still cool but livable. I could walk on it in stockings without feeling my feet go numb. My aunt had been right. The trench was teaching the wind where it could not go. But the town still didn't believe. Jed Purcell, the storekeeper, was the worst. He had a way of smiling that made the smile feel like a weapon, and he used it every time I came in to buy nails or trade dried rabbit meat for flour. In late January, I went to his store to ask about credit for boards. The south cover needed reinforcement before the heavy snows came, and I had run out of salvage lumber. Jed looked at me over his counter, that smile already forming. "You planning to heat the house or pickle the wood, girl?" "I'm planning not to lose my heat through the floor." He laughed then, the full, ugly kind. He turned to the men gathered by the stove, 3 farmers waiting out a slow afternoon, and he said, "Hear that? The orphan girl is fixing winter. Ditch widow's grandniece thinks she can outsmart the cold with a ring of kindling." One of the men chuckled. Another shook his head. I felt my face go hot, not from the stove. "My aunt spent 20 years measuring how cold moves through a cabin," I said. "She knew what she was doing." "Your aunt dug a ditch around her house and died before she could prove anything." Jed's smile sharpened. "You're welcome to follow her example, but I'm not extending credit to help you do it faster." I walked out without the boards. I walked home in the cold 8 miles, and I arrived after dark with my hands numb and my feet aching and my throat tight with the kind of rage that has nowhere to go. But I didn't stop. I found other boards. I traded labor, 2 days of washing and mending for a neighbor woman who had twisted her ankle, for a stack of old crate slats. I pulled apart a fallen outbuilding on the northwest corner of my aunt's claim and salvaged what timber hadn't rotted. The work went slower without proper materials. The cover wasn't as neat as Nels would have liked, but by the time the first heavy snow came in February, the ring was complete. Nels came to check on me the morning after that snow. He stood in the center of my cabin, in the spot where the floor had always been coldest, and he was barefoot. He had taken off his boots at the door like a man performing an experiment. He stood there on the floorboards, with his stockinged feet flat against the wood and his eyes closed, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he opened his eyes and he grinned like a boy who had found a penny in the street. "She was right," he said. "Belle Mercer was right." I nodded. I couldn't speak just then. "You did it, girl. You finished what she started." I looked at the hatch by the stove. I looked at the frost-free windows. I looked at the floor where I had once measured coldness in heartbeats and now measured only ordinary cool. "We finished it," I said. "You helped." "I showed you how to swing a hammer." Nels shook his head. "She gave you the science. You gave it the work." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The settlement won't believe it until they see it tested. Really tested. One warm cabin in an ordinary winter isn't proof. It's luck. They'll say the winter was mild. They'll say you got fortunate with the wind. They'll need to see it hold when the holding matters." "What does that mean?" Nels looked toward the window, toward the white prairie stretching away under its new snow. "It means you better hope the winter stays gentle," he said. "Or it means you better hope that trench holds when the winter stops being gentle, because those are the only 2 ways this ends. Either nothing tests it and nobody believes, or something tests it hard, And everybody sees. He pulled his boots back on, and he left. I stood in my warm cabin, and I listened to the wind move across the snow outside, and I understood what he hadn't quite said. The real test hadn't come yet, and I didn't know if I wanted it to. That winter passed without the test Nels had warned me about. The cold came and went in ordinary waves. The snow fell and melted and fell again. The trench held steady, the wood stayed dry, and my floor stayed warm while the prairie wind complained outside like something cheated of its due. By spring, I had survived my first Nebraska winter on land everyone said would kill me. But survival and proof are different things. Nels came twice a week through that first spring. His wagon would appear on the horizon around mid-morning, and I would stop whatever I was doing and walk out to meet him because the sight of another human being had become precious to me in ways I hadn't expected. He taught me things no book could have taught me. How to read the grain of a board before cutting it. How to set a post so deep that spring heave wouldn't shift it. How to brace a corner joint against wind load using half the lumber a less careful builder would waste. His left shoulder had never healed right after the wagon accident. The joint sat lower than the other, and he couldn't raise his arm above his head without his face going tight with pain. But his hands still knew their work. He could feel with his fingertips whether a board was true, whether a joint would hold, whether a measurement was close enough or needed another pass with the plane. "Your aunt had the science," he told me one afternoon while we were reinforcing the east cover. She understood why the cold moved the way it did, but she didn't have the building. She was working from first principles, figuring out every joint like nobody had ever joined wood before. She did well enough. She did remarkable. Nels set down his plane and looked at the trench ring, at the work we had done together. But she was alone, and alone is hard. Alone wears you down. I didn't say anything. I knew what alone felt like. "The planes took my wife in the fever spring of '76, Nels said. It was the first time he had told me more than the single sentence. 3 days from healthy to buried. I sat by her bed and watched her go somewhere I couldn't follow, and when it was over I walked outside and I stood in my own yard and I didn't recognize anything. The barn, the house, the sky. It all looked like a place I'd never been before. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." He picked up the plane again. "But I remember what alone feels like. And I remember how much it matters when someone shows up." He looked at me then, and his eyes were kind in a way that had nothing to do with pity. "Your aunt didn't have that. She worked alone for 20 years, and she died alone, and nobody came. But you came, and I came. And that makes it different." I didn't trust myself to speak. "We're going to finish this," Nels said. "We're going to prove she was right. And when the settlement sees it, when they really see it, they won't be able to unsee it. That's how ideas work. Once people understand, they can't go back to not understanding." He was wrong about that last part, as it turned out. People can always choose not to understand. But he was right about the rest. Summer came, and I used it to fix everything I had done badly in my first desperate months. I widened the drainage on the southeast corner where water had pooled after spring melt. I replaced 3 posts that had started to rot at ground level, my fault for setting them too shallow, a mistake I would never make again. I improved the cover boards with proper overlapping seams that shed rain instead of channeling it into the wood below. By autumn of 1886, the system was better than it had been. By autumn of '87, it was better still. I measured constantly floor temperatures, or fuel consumption, hours between stokings. I kept my own journals now, in the same style my aunt had used, because I understood finally why she had written everything down. Memory is unreliable, numbers are not. And if someone came after me, if some other girl inherited this land and found herself standing over a trench she didn't understand, I wanted her to have what my aunt had given me: instructions, measurements, proof. The physical cost was visible by then. My hands had calloused so thick I could pick up hot iron from the stove and feel only pressure, not pain. My shoulders had thickened with muscle I hadn't known women could build. I had scars on my shins from climbing in and out of the trench, and a permanent callus on my right palm where the shovel handle pressed hardest. I was 18 years old. I looked older. I felt older. But I was alive, and I was warm, and I had built something that worked. The first outside person to notice was a woman named Marta Keller. Her family stopped for water one mild winter day. Husband, 3 children, a wagon loaded with household goods heading west toward a new claim. I invited them inside to warm up before continuing. Marta stepped over my threshold and stopped. She stood very still for a moment, her youngest child on her hip, and then she said, "Your floor isn't cold." Not warm first, that detail mattered. On the plains, in winter, absence of cold is miracle enough. "No," I said, "it isn't." She looked at me like I had performed some kind of witchcraft. Then she looked at the hatch by the stove, and at the window where frost should have been gathering but wasn't, and at the corners where ice should have been silvering the chinking but wasn't. "How?" she asked. I showed her. I walked her around the trench ring. I explained the wind block and the cold sink. I showed her the covered wood and the drainage pitch and the hatch access. I told her about my aunt's journals and the 20 years of measurements, and the theory that the settlement had dismissed as madness. Marta Keller listened to everything I said. When I finished, she stood at the edge of the trench and looked at it the way you look at something you can't quite believe but can't quite deny either. "Could we build this?" she asked. "On our new claim?" "You could build part of it. Even just the north side would help. That's where the wind comes from." She nodded slowly. Then she reached out and touched my arm, just briefly, just for a moment, and she said, "Thank you for showing me." They left that afternoon. I never saw Marta Keller again, but I thought about her hand on my arm for a long time afterward. It was the first time anyone had thanked me for what I knew instead of laughing at it. Word spread the way things spread on the frontier, not through announcements or newspapers, but through the practical network of people who needed things from each other. A neighbor named Hollis came by to see the trench after his wife mentioned it at church. He studied my system for an hour, asked questions about measurements, and then went home and dug a shallow windbreak trench along the north wall of his chicken coop. His hens stopped dying from cold that winter. He never thanked me directly, but he started nodding to me in town instead of looking away. I began trading dry kindling bundles for flour, because mine stayed dry when everyone else's got wet. Measured advice for lamp oil, an afternoon helping someone plan a trench line in exchange for things I needed. The trades were small, but they added up. By the end of 1887, I was eating regularly and sleeping warmly and no longer losing weight every time the weather turned. But the doubters remained. Amos Klein was the worst of them. He was a land agent and small lender who had been circling my aunt's claim for years, hoping to pick it up cheap when she failed. When she died, he assumed the land would revert to the county. When I arrived, he assumed I would fail faster than she had. I met him at my fence line one gray afternoon in late autumn. He rode up on a good horse, better than anything I could have afforded, and he sat there looking down at me like I was something unfortunate he had found on the sole of his boot. "Miss Mercer." He didn't tip his hat. "I see you're still here." "I am." "Your aunt owed the county $17 in back taxes when she died. Did you know that?" I hadn't known that. My stomach tightened. "The county is prepared to forgive that debt," Amos said, "in exchange for a quitclaim on the property. You could walk away clean, no debt, no obligation. There are better places for a girl your age than a dead woman's failed experiment." "The experiment isn't failed." Amos smiled the way men smile when they know something you don't. "Miss Mercer, you've been here 2 winters. You've survived. Congratulations. But survival isn't success. A girl alone can't hold land out here, not permanently. Wind or taxes will take it in the end. I'm offering you a way out before that happens." "The trench works," I said. "My floor stays warm, my wood stays dry. I use 1/3 less fuel than I did before I finished it." "So you say." He looked toward the cabin, toward the ring of covered wood around the foundation. "What I see is a ditch and some boards. What the county sees is an eccentric claim that's barely producing enough to cover its costs. What the settlement sees," he paused, "well, you know what they see. The ditch widow's grandniece, digging the same hole her aunt dug, hoping for a different result. You keep digging like that," he said, "and you'll bury your own title." I looked up at him on his good horse with his good clothes and his confident smile. and I felt the anger rise in me like heat. "Then I'll be buried warm," I said. He laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. "January will sort this out," he said. "It always does." He rode away. I stood at my fence line watching him go, and I thought about what he had said. A girl alone can't hold land out here. He was wrong, but I didn't know yet how I was going to prove it. The proof came in a form I would never have chosen. Professor Martin Kelsey arrived in early December of 1887. He was the principal of the West Union School, a small frame building about 4 miles south of my claim, and he was also an amateur weather observer who had been tracking temperature and precipitation patterns across Custer County for 7 years. He had heard about my floor from his students. Some of them lived on claims near mine, and their parents had started talking about the orphan girl with the warm cabin. Kelsey was curious. He wanted to see for himself. He came alone, on foot, carrying a leather satchel that clinked with instruments. He was a thin man with spectacles and the kind of careful movements that suggested he was used to being laughed at for the things he cared about. I showed him everything. I walked him through the trench system. I explained the wind block theory and the cold sink principle. I showed him my aunt's journals, the 20 years of observations, the floor temperature measurements, the sketches of wind patterns. He listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small book he pulled from his satchel. When I finished, he asked if he could take some measurements of his own. I said yes. He spent 3 hours in and around my cabin. He placed thermometers at different heights, one near the ceiling, one at waist level, one near the floor. He measured underfloor air temperature by lying flat on his stomach with a thermometer poked through a gap between boards. He checked wind speed at ground level and at 4 feet. He measured the temperature inside the covered trench. When he was done, he sat at my table with his notes spread out in front of him, and he looked at me with an expression I didn't recognize at first. It took me a moment to realize it was respect. "This is remarkable," he said. "Why doesn't anyone know about this? They think it's foolishness. They think my aunt was crazy." "Your aunt was conducting field research." Kelsey tapped his notes. "This data is real. The temperature differential between your floor and a standard cabin floor is significant. The fuel savings are measurable. The principle is sound. Cold air is denser. It sinks, and if you give it somewhere lower to settle, it settles there instead of pooling beneath your living space." "I know," I said. "My aunt wrote all of that down. Nobody believed her." "They should have." Kelsey was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Would you allow me to share this? I have colleagues in Lincoln who study building efficiency. I write occasional pieces for the county agricultural circular. People should know about this." I thought about Jed Purcell laughing at me across his counter. I thought about Amos Klein on his good horse telling me the county would sort it out. I thought about all the people who had dismissed my aunt while she was alive and mocked her after she was dead. "Yes," I said. "Share it." He nodded once, the way Nels nodded when a thing was settled. "This winter has been mild so far," he said as he packed his instruments. "The wells are holding. The ground hasn't frozen deep, but you should know." He paused at my door. "The patterns I've been tracking suggest we're due for something worse. Maybe this year, maybe next. The mild winters don't last forever." "I know," I said. "Your system will be tested eventually," he said. "When it is, I hope I'm here to see it." He walked back toward West Union, and I watched him go, and I thought about what he had said. The wells were reliable that year. Everyone's wells. On the prairie. When everything's going well, that usually means trouble is already on the road. The morning of January 12th, 1888, broke warm. I remember that specifically because it was wrong. January in Nebraska is not supposed to feel like late March, but that morning the air was soft, the wind was gentle, the sky was pale blue and almost pleasant. By noon, the world had ended. I don't know how else to describe what happened. The wind shifted hard out of the northwest, and the temperature dropped so fast I could feel it falling around me like something solid. The sky turned gray, then dark, then white with snow that drove sideways so thick I couldn't see the edge of the trench from my own doorway. The sound was the worst part. Not like wind, like a train, like a continuous roar that never stopped, never paused, never gave you a moment to think. I got inside. I stayed inside. I fed the stove from the hatch every hour because the cold was pressing against the walls like something trying to get in. The trench held. The wood stayed dry. My floors stayed warm, but I could hear the prairie dying outside. The storm lasted 2 days. When it finally broke, when the wind finally stopped screaming and the snow finally stopped driving sideways, I opened my door and I saw a world I didn't recognize. Snow everywhere, but strange snow, packed hard as wood by the wind, drifted into shapes that didn't make sense, piled against some walls and stripped bare from others. The cold was so deep it hurt to breathe. The sky was pale blue and empty of mercy. I learned later what had happened across the territory. Children had been caught between school and home. Farmers had been caught between barn and house. People had frozen to death within sight of their own doorsteps because the wind and snow were so thick they couldn't see where safety was. They called it the Children's Blizzard. 235 people died. On my claim, in my trench-protected cabin, I had stayed warm and dry and alive. The first person to come for help was Mrs. Agatha Hargrove. I saw her through the cleared space of my doorway on the morning after the storm broke. She was walking across the prairie from the direction of town, walking because the roads were impassable and the horses were half dead and nobody had any other choice. She was carrying a child. The child was bundled in blankets, but the blankets were crusted with ice. Mrs. Hargrove's face was red with cold and white with fear. She had walked 4 miles through hip-deep drifts and wind chill that could kill you in minutes. And she had done it because she had nowhere else to go. I watched her approach. I watched her stop at the edge of my trench, looking down at the covered wood like she was seeing it for the first time. I watched her raise her eyes to meet mine. She didn't say please. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge that she had stood in a courtroom and laughed while I was humiliated. She just said, "I need help. The dormitory stove can't hold against the draft. We're out of dry wood. This girl," she shifted the bundle in her arms, "her feet have gone white." I could have said no. I could have reminded her of everything she had said and done. I could have made her beg, the way she had made me feel like begging when I was 15 and friendless, and holding a worthless piece of paper that promised me nothing but mockery. Instead, I said, "Bring her inside." I opened the hatch by the stove. I pulled up an armload of dry firewood wood that had stayed dry through 2 days of the worst storm in Nebraska history, because my aunt's crazy trench had done exactly what my aunt said it would do. "Take this," I said. "Come back if you need more." Mrs. Hargrove looked at the wood. She looked at me. For one moment, I saw something in her face that might have been shame. "Thank you," she said. "Go," I said. "Get that girl warm." She went. An hour later, she came back with 2 more dormitory girls and the school's headmaster. I gave them more wood. By afternoon, the line at my trench stretched back toward the road. They came all day and into the evening. Marta Keller's family wasn't among them. They were somewhere west on their new claim beyond my reach. But everyone else came. Families whose names I barely knew. Families whose faces I recognized from town. The Hollis family, whose chicken coop I had helped trench the year before. Old Mrs. Rausch, who had run out of dry fuel because her stack had drifted over and frozen solid. I stood by my hatch and I handed up firewood bundle after bundle. My arms ached. My back ached. My hands went raw again in places where the calluses had softened over the mild autumn. I didn't count what I gave. I didn't track who owed me. I didn't make anyone say thank you or apologize or acknowledge that they had laughed at my aunt's work. They needed warmth. I had warmth. The transaction was that simple. Nels arrived in the late afternoon. He had walked from his own cabin 3 miles away, and his face was gray with exhaustion. But he was alive. His trench, a smaller version he had dug along his north wall after seeing mine work, had held through the storm. He stood at the edge of my ring and watched me hand up wood to a woman I didn't know, and he said, "They don't deserve it, you know. Half these people laughed at your aunt. Half of them laughed at you." I set down the bundle I was holding. I looked at the line of people waiting. I saw Jed Purcell's hired hand sent to fetch wood because Jed's own supply had iced over. I saw the wife of the land agent who had offered to buy my claim for back taxes. I saw faces that had turned away from me in town, faces that had whispered when I walked past, faces that had believed I was foolish for staying and crazy for digging. Maybe not, I said. But cold doesn't ask who was kind before it kills them, and warmth shouldn't either. Nels looked at me for a long moment. Then he picked up a bundle of wood and carried it to the next person in line. Amos Klein came on the second day. He arrived on foot like everyone else. His good horse had died in the storm, frozen in its traces between his house and his barn. His good clothes were wet and stiff with ice. His confident smile was gone. He stood at the back of the line and waited his turn. When he reached the front, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. It might have been humility. It might have been bitterness that looked like humility because he had no other choice. "I need wood," he said. I handed him a bundle. "Miss Mercer." "Take the wood," I said. "Go home. Get warm." He took the wood. He stood there holding it, and for a moment I thought he might say something, an apology, an acknowledgement, something human. Instead he said, "This doesn't change anything. One winter doesn't prove—" "Mr. Klein." I cut him off. "Your hands are turning blue. Go home." He went. He never apologized. He never acknowledged that he had been wrong. But he never tried to take my land again, either. Some people, that's the closest they can come to admitting they were beaten. I decided it was enough. The storm killed 235 people across the territory. On my claim, in my aunt's cabin, surrounded by my aunt's trench, filled with dry wood that had stayed dry while the world froze, not one person died. Professor Kelsey came 3 days after the roads cleared. He measured everything again: floor temperatures, fuel consumption, wood moisture content, trench drainage. He filled an entire notebook. When he was done, he sat at my table and he looked at his data and he said, "This needs to be documented properly. Your aunt's work deserves to be known. It won't bring her back." No. He closed his notebook. But it might save lives, other winters, other storms. If people understand what she understood, if they build what she built, he wrote to colleagues in Lincoln. He published a short article in the county circular describing the trench system and its performance during the January blizzard. He drew a clean diagram of the design and distributed it to anyone who asked. Within a year, a dozen homesteads within 20 miles of my claim had built some version of the ring. Within 5 years, the idea had spread to 3 counties. My aunt's crazy ditch had become a recognized building technique, not universal, not famous, but known, adopted, used. Isabel Bell Mercer's name appeared in Professor Kelsey's article. For the first time in her life, or rather, for the first time after her death, someone with credentials had written her name alongside words like innovative and practical and life-saving. She would never read those words, but I read them. And I kept the clipping in the front of her first journal, where it belonged. Mrs. Agatha Hargrove came back one more time, not during the storm. Weeks later, when the roads had cleared and the dead had been counted, and the settlement had started putting itself back together. She came alone, on a mild February afternoon, and she stood on my footbridge with her hands folded in front of her like she was reporting for inspection. "Miss Mercer," she said, "may I speak with you?" I could have said no. I could have reminded her of the courtroom, the laughter, the line about jokes that people would tell until Christmas. "Come inside," I said. She stood in my cabin, the warm cabin, the cabin whose floor didn't freeze, the cabin she had mocked and dismissed and refused to believe in, and she looked around like she was seeing it for the first time. Then she looked at me. "I was wrong about the land," she said. "And I was wrong about you." I didn't say anything. I let the silence work. "Your aunt," Mrs. Hargrove paused. She seemed to be gathering herself for something difficult. "Your aunt wrote to me twice, when you were 14. She had heard about you from relatives, your reading, your curiosity, your difficulty with placements. She offered to take you on as a helper, and an air. She thought you might be suited to this life. She thought, another pause. She thought you might understand her work. My hands had gone cold, not from temperature, from something else. I never gave you those letters. I knew. I already knew, before she said the rest, but I let her say it anyway. One letter I filed away. I thought the woman was unstable. I thought the claim was worthless. I thought sending you to her would be cruel, abandoning a girl to a madwoman's folly. Mrs. Hargrove's voice was steady, but something in her face was crumbling. The second letter I burned with stove scraps. I told myself I was protecting you. 2 letters, 2 chances for my aunt to reach me, to teach me, to have company in her final years. 2 chances for me to learn from her while she was alive instead of piecing together her knowledge from journals after she was dead. Mrs. Hargrove had burned one of them. I stood in my aunt's cabin, and I felt the anger rise in me like pressure behind my eyes. I thought about my aunt dying alone. I thought about myself arriving 2 years too late, inheriting a corpse's work instead of a living teacher's wisdom. I thought about everything that had been stolen from both of us. And then I thought about the dormitory girl with the white feet, about Mrs. Hargrove walking 4 miles through killing cold to ask for help from someone she had wronged, about what it must have cost her to come here now, to stand in this cabin, to say these words out loud. I forgive you, I said. Mrs. Hargrove blinked. She had been braced for something else. Not because you judged rightly too late, I said, because I will not hand you the rest of my life as well. She stood very still for a moment. Then she nodded once, the smallest movement, barely perceptible, and she walked out my door and across my footbridge and away across the prairie. I never saw her again outside of town. She lived another 11 years and died of pneumonia in the winter of '99. I did not go to her funeral, but I had forgiven her, and I meant it. The rest of my life was too valuable to spend carrying her weight. Nels died in the spring of 1891, not during the blizzard. He had survived that, but the blizzard had taken something out of him that he never got back, some reserve of strength that had been holding him together despite his years. After that winter, he moved slower. He coughed more. His bad shoulder troubled him on days when it hadn't troubled him before. I found him on a March morning sitting in his chair by the south window with his work gloves on the table and a bowl of barley soup gone cold beside him. He looked peaceful. He looked like a man who had finished what he needed to finish and then sat down to rest. I buried him on a slight rise east of his cabin, where he could keep an eye on foolish building. I planted 2 young cottonwoods on his grave, real windbreaks, the living version of what he and my aunt had taught me to construct. I stood by those saplings, and I spoke the only words I could think of that seemed fitting. You showed up. That made it different. He left me his tools, his brace and bit set, his wagon, a folded note that named me the best weather-minded builder Belle Mercer ever produced. I was 22 years old. I had survived 5 Nebraska winters. I had built a system that saved lives. And I had lost the only person who had believed in me from the beginning. The cottonwoods are still there. I checked on them every year until I couldn't walk that far anymore. They grew tall and thick, and they blocked the wind exactly the way Nels would have wanted them to. I married Elias Venn in 1893. He was a blacksmith's widowed son who had come to see the trench system after reading Professor Kelsey's article. He asked me questions about drainage pitch and post depth and cover spans, and he listened to my answers like they mattered. And I knew before he left that first day that he was different from the men who had looked at me in town and seen only a strange girl covered in dirt. He was the kind of man who listened more than he talked. That was rare. It still is. We had 3 children. By 1895, a dozen homesteads near mine had built some version of the trench ring. By 1900, I was advising new settlers on placement and construction. By the time I was old, I was known less as the orphan and more as Mercer of the warm floor house, the woman who had finished what the ditch widow started. The work never stopped. Even when I couldn't dig anymore, I could teach. Even when I couldn't teach, I could point. My feet could still tell from the boards alone where a draft was entering. My hands knew the feel of wood that would rot from wood that would last. I grew old in my aunt's cabin, in the warmth she had designed and I had built. It was a good life. It was better than anyone expected. I died on a bright March morning, the kind of morning that reminds you winter is finally losing its grip. They found me in the kitchen, kneeling beside the hatch with kindling in my lap. I had been reaching down into the trench one more time, doing the work that had saved me and saved others, and I had simply stopped. My eldest daughter said later that I looked like I had heard the wind and decided it didn't concern me anymore. The trench is still there. The cabin has been rebuilt twice, once after a fire, once when the original logs finally gave out, but the ring around the foundation has never been filled in. My granddaughter maintains it now. She teaches the technique to anyone who asks. Isabel Bell Mercer's surviving journal pages hang framed in the County Historical Society, next to a photograph of my aunt that I never knew existed until someone found it in a Lincoln archive. She is standing beside her cabin, one hand resting on a fence post, looking at the camera with an expression that might be defiance, or might be patience, or might be both. Below the photograph is her line, the one I carried with me through 60 years on that prairie. What saves a house on the prairie is not always what you build above ground. Sometimes salvation is the ring you cut where the cold wants to run. Mrs. Hargrove laughed in that probate office. She called the claim 160 acres of wind. She said the joke would last until Christmas. The joke is still there, still keeping people warm, and I think it will outlast every word she ever spoke. So let me ask you something. What in your life looks foolish while you're still digging it? What are you building that no one else can see yet? The thing that looks like a hole in the ground to everyone passing by. But you know in the part of yourself that doesn't lie, that it's going to hold when the wind comes? What did someone tell you about yourself that you believed? What verdict did they deliver while you stood there with nothing, watching them laugh? And are you still carrying that verdict around like it's true? Like it was ever true? Like the people who pronounced it had any idea what you were actually capable of? The trench looked like madness. The ditch looked like a grave. The work looked like wasted effort by a woman too stubborn to admit she was beaten. But January came, and the trench held, and the people who laughed stood in line to receive what they had mocked. That's how it works. That's how it has always worked. The conditions don't have to be perfect. They almost never are. You don't have to wait until everyone understands. You don't have to wait until the laughing stops. You don't have to wait until someone shows up to validate what you already know is true. You just have to keep digging. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own unfinished work, your own mocked beginnings, the trench you've been afraid to keep cutting because everyone tells you it's foolish, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary lives out of the nothing they were given. Your trench may look like a joke to everyone standing dry in October. Dig it anyway. January is coming.